Hi, and welcome to another episode of Interviews with the Authors. I'm James Prothro. I teach here at the Augustine Institute, and I'm joined by my colleague, Michael Patrick Barber, and we're going to give him a few minutes here to talk about his new book, The Historical Jesus and the Temple, Memory, Methodology, and the Gospel of Matthew. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. This is a delight.
So this book is published by Cambridge University Press, and I've read it. It's really clearly written. It's not obscure to follow, but it's very definitely an academic book. And it's if that was your goal, it's done really well there. I just want to read a couple of the endorsements on the back. One of them from Dale Allison, who's a professor of New Testament at Princeton Theological Seminary and has been working in Jesus and historical Jesus for a long time. And he writes, Barber demonstrates between the covers of one book the multiple ways in which the first gospel, in its presentation of Jesus' relationship to the temple, to Davidic motifs, and to traditions about sacrifice and priesthood, plausibly mirrors what Jesus himself taught and shows us, in important ways, Matthew's interpretive framework is not an obstacle in our way, but a path to the historical Jesus. And then also another short one. There's several really great ones here, but another short one from a Jewish scholar, Amy Jill Levine, who's professor emerita at Vanderbilt, who writes, in this brilliant study of Jesus' relation to the Jerusalem temple, to priesthood, and to sacrifice, Barber offers both a compelling reading of Matthew's gospel and a plausible new entry into the study of the man from Nazareth. Highly recommended.
That meant so much to me, that both of those scholars were willing to endorse it. And Dale actually wrote a foreword for the book. Was just huge for me. I've been reading Dale Allison's works for decades. I've read everything that he's written, and oftentimes, multiple times, keep going back to his books and learning from them. So it was just a tremendous shot in the arm for the book, for me, to have those endorsements from the two of them. They were very kind to do that. They didn't need to do that.
Well, it's fabulous. And Allison even calls you in the foreword a pioneer in the field of historical Jesus studies. And so this is a great achievement, and congratulations.
Thank you.
And to give a little bit of time to open up the book and your motivations for the book, I mean, as you can see from the title, and you can hear definitely from those endorsements, Dr. Barber has written several different books, right? You've written on salvation, you've written on other parts of Scripture, you've written on theology, but lately especially it seems that you've got a real interest in the New Testament, in especially its historical and theologically its Jewish setting. So he's got co-authored with two others, Paul, a New Covenant Jew, and now here one on the historical Jesus and the temple. Can you tell us a little bit about this interest?
Sure, yeah. Well, it goes back a long time, and of course the Paul book came out in 2019, and then this one comes out in 2023. So they're relatively close together, but I've been doing this for a long time. My doctoral dissertation was actually on the historical Jesus and looking at him within the context of the Jewish world of his day. I think it's really important to read the New Testament with an eye to the Jewish world. And the more that I have studied the New Testament from that kind of angle, the more it sort of pops, the more it comes alive. So I think we miss a lot when we fail to do that. And as a Catholic, I think it's also really helpful to recognize that while we certainly have much to learn from the tradition of the church theologically, we know more about Second Temple Judaism. We know more about the Jewish world of Jesus' day today than the early church fathers did, or Thomas Aquinas did. So while I love reading Thomas Aquinas' commentary on Matthew, there are all sorts of beautiful insights, tremendous spiritual gems, things that he says about the Beatitudes that'll stay with me for my entire life. There are also things he says about Second Temple Judaism that are just, laughably untrue. So we actually recognize that biblical studies can advance and we can actually learn new things. So for a lot of my Catholic friends, there's this sort of suspicion that if it's new, it's probably not true. And that's actually a view that is explicitly condemned by Pope Pius XII in his work on on his encyclical on biblical studies, Divino Afflante Spiritu. He says we have to, keep in check that, as he calls it, intemperate zeal that would think that we have nothing new to learn. And so this is something for me that's been very exciting. I think we can have a richer and more accurate understanding of various aaspects of the New Testament's teaching when we read it carefully in light of that Jewish backdrop.
Well, that's great, and I'm glad you mentioned that. I was thinking of that while you were describing that, because Pope Pius XII also in Divino Afflante Spiritu talks about all the new discoveries about the ancient world of Judaism, especially as a gift of divine providence that we need to respond to, not to leave behind the tradition, right? But to find a more robust understanding at the roots of it, right?
That's
and
right.
its foundations.
That's right.
And you do that really well here. And one of the things that is notable about this book is that not only are you using a lot of new discoveries about Second Temple Judaism that we've been spending at least the last 100 years working through as scholars. We haven't been around that long, but the bigger we, right? But also new work in methodology about thinking of the historical Jesus, because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of times the historical Jesus is pit against the Jesus of the Gospels, like Matthew and others. And one of the things that you're able to do in this study is to show that Matthew actually gives us, as Allison says in this endorsement, Matthew actually gives us a very plausible picture of Jesus. So you actually are able not to throw the historical Jesus and the gospel away from each other, but actually to draw them closer and to show this in the book.
Yeah, so one of the ways scholars have interpreted Jesus is to interpret him against what we find in early Christianity. So in other words, if we find something in the Gospels that is apparently in tension with the beliefs of the early church, then we can therefore say this more likely goes back to the historical Jesus. So Jesus is defined against the theology of the early church, and Jesus is really someone who has to be pried apart from the interests of the evangelists. And so I start the book with actually a story of Thomas Jefferson. And it's sort of a fun way into the conversation, is to just show that what a lot of people think is new or cutting edge scholarship is really sort of worn out and I think tired. This idea that somehow we can look at the Gospels and then excavate them and figure out, well, what's the earliest layer? And then what's the layer on top of that? And we can get through all these interpretations of Jesus from early Christians and then finally arrive at the uninterpreted Jesus. And the more we think about methodology and the more scholars have appreciated the impact of memory research in historiography, the more we come to recognize the folly of that approach. That you really can't separate memory out because memory is itself interpretive, right? So without getting into a long conversation about that, the gist of all of this is when we read the Gospels, the real question is, why do they remember Jesus in this way? And what I want to argue is Matthew in particular remembers Jesus in this way because he has Jewish concerns. And so this is one of the areas I think we need to rethink in Jesus research. Rather than reading Jesus against the theology of, say, Matthew, we might actually turn that question around and say, well, what might Matthew, as a first century Jew, help us understand would have been a priority for a Jewish teacher like Jesus? So just to give an illustration of this, one of the standard ways people have approached the historical Jesus is to pit him against things like the temple, things like priesthood, things like ritual. And the more we look at this and the more we unpack it, the more we discover the roots of this are actually in a Protestant sort of bias against ritual and liturgy and priesthood, things that are sort of Catholic concerns. But even more, we see here a sort of anti-Semitism, right? That priesthood and ritual are the kinds of things that Jesus came to liberate us from. They were, bound by these old traditions, and Jesus comes as a kind of charismatic figure to set us free from that kind of tradition. I think this is really unhelpful. So what I want to actually do is show that as a first century Jew, Jesus would have affirmed the holiness of the temple. Yes, he announces its coming destruction, but that's not because he believes that temple, priesthood, and sacrifice are inherently problematic. And I think the more we read Matthew, we recognize Matthew's emphasizing this. Jesus says in Matthew 23 that you shouldn't swear by the temple. Why? Because it's the altar that makes the sacrifice holy. That's a view that comes right out of the book of Leviticus, that it's the altar itself that consecrates the sacrifice. So the temple is not in and of itself a problem. Priesthood is not in and of itself a problem. First century Jews would have reverenced the temple. And so I think that needs to inform the way we look at Jesus' teaching. And what I want to show is that Jesus not only affirmed the holiness of temple, priesthood, and sacrifice, but that he also wanted to help us think about his work and the early community, the church, in terms of temple, priesthood, and sacrifice.
Yeah, and you mentioned a second ago the connection between these. You get scholars who will read the Gospels and say, "Oh, Jesus is opposing the Pharisees."
Right.
For the same reason that Luther opposed the Catholics,
right.
Because they're just obsessed with...
Right. And everybody forgets that Jesus says about the Pharisees that they sit on Moses' seat, so therefore do whatever they tell you. Mm-hmm. Well, how can Jesus say that if he thinks that the Pharisees in and of themselves are, not valid authorities? Jesus affirms them as sitting on the seat of Moses. Mm-hmm. I think that needs to challenge us a little bit more than it has.
Mm-hmm. And so coming straight into Matthew and the way he remembers Jesus in our last few minutes here. So why Matthew, and how does Matthew help us? Because you mentioned a second ago, you said, first century Jews would have revered the temple, right? Which is true, but of course there's some who think it's so compromised that they don't want to have anything to do with it.
That's right.
But that's not really the picture we get of Jesus.
Absolutely
Certainly
not.
Not of the Holy Family in Luke's Gospel.
Right,
Tell me
but also not in Matthew. So
Yeah.
Matthew, for example, has Jesus affirm that you should not swear by the temple. That's in Matthew 23. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about how when you go to the altar to present your gift, he's talking about presenting a sacrifice at the temple, right? This is what you ought to do. Jesus doesn't say, well, the new covenant has come, so we don't need ritual and sacrifice and worship anymore. Just pray in your heart, and all the rest is sort of passé. He doesn't say that. So why Matthew? Well, first of all, like I said, scholars used to want to argue that we need to separate Jesus from early Christianity. But what we recognize more and more is that Paul didn't stop seeing himself as a Jew. Paul continues to identify himself as a Jew. And likewise, scholarship is showing that the Gospel of Matthew is written by someone who still views himself as a Jew. He's affirming the authority of, for example, the synagogues and other things. So the author of the Gospel of Matthew isn't somehow post-Jewish. He's still Jewish. And so this is a major problem. If you're going to start interpreting Jesus against Matthean Christianity, then what you're doing is you're still doing Jesus versus Judaism, and that's something that scholars have wanted to get away from for a long time and really affirm Jesus really is Jewish. So Matthew helps us in that way. The other thing I think Matthew really emphasizes in lots of different ways is the way that the community is to be understood as a temple. The church, the ecclesia, is understood as a temple. My favorite example of this is in Matthew 16, the famous scene where Jesus tells Peter he's the rock and he's going to build the church on him. How does that unfold? Well, Jesus says, "Who do men say that I am?" And they say, well, Jeremiah, one of the prophets, John the Baptist. And he said, okay, but who do you say that I am? And then this is where Peter steps up and he says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Well, here Peter is affirming that Jesus is the Messiah, and he's specifically the Messiah that was hoped for from the line of David, because in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is the Messiah, he's the son of David, the son of Abraham. And moreover, we see he's the Son of the living God. The Davidic king was understood to be the Son of God. So it's interesting that then Jesus turns around and says, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah," and then he says, Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you. And then he goes on to say, I will build my church. You are a rock, and on this rock I will build my church. Well, that's interesting because the son of David was known as not just the king, not just as son of God, but specifically, if you look at the texts where the Davidic king, the son of David, is the son of God, it usually is also emphasized that he's the temple builder. So Jesus is speaking of himself as the son of David, as the Messiah, but also as the temple builder. But instead of talking about the temple, he talks about building the ecclesia, the church. So right there, we can see that the church is being understood in temple terms. And so liturgy, worship, priesthood, these are not ideas that are, for Jesus, things that are to be abolished, but things that are going to be taken up into the new covenant, and hopes that Jews had for temple, priesthood, and cult are going to be fulfilled and transcended in some ways in what Jesus announces is going to be realized in the church and in I would say the sacraments as well, in the Eucharist, right?
Yeah, and so there's a beautiful double yes here, right? Instead of a double no, right? Where we take the Gospels as making Jesus anti-Jewish, right? Or we decide to find the real Jesus, we have to be anti-Gospels.
Right.
But actually here, right, by looking at Matthew and by using studies of memory, and by reading Matthew really, really closely for what it says and doesn't say, you can say both a yes to the fully Jewish context of Jesus, and then also yes to, you might say, the kind of the new covenant, right, the newness that he brings, right? So that's really wonderful. We're close to the end of our time. If you could give me a really short pitch, who do you want to read this book? Who do you hope will read this?
Well, okay, so this book is not just written for anybody who has an interest in theology. It's written for people who have been immersed in historical Jesus studies and academic studies of the New Testament. Now, I hope that it's clear enough that people who aren't scholars can read it, and I've been very grateful to hear that people who aren't scholars have read it and said, I learned a lot and I understood it, so that's really helpful. But I'm especially writing this for people who are interested in recent discussions about the way historical Jesus should be approached, the question of the historical Jesus should be approached. And I'm also writing it for people who are interested in gospel studies broadly, especially those who are interested in Matthean studies in particular. And I think if we bring, for a long time, historical Jesus studies has been over here, and Matthean studies has been over here, and people only use the Gospel of Matthew and historical Jesus studies to try to find material from Q or something like that. What I want to say is, instead of trying to read through the Gospel of Matthew to get to the historical Jesus, let's read Matthew's narrative as a whole and see what it might tell us about the kinds of concerns that Jesus himself as a Jewish teacher would have had.
That's great. Well, if you are in that target audience or you're otherwise interested and ready to take it up, the book is Historical Jesus and the Temple, Memory, Methodology, and the Gospel of Matthew. And you can find information down below about where to get this book. In the meantime, thank you so much, Dr.
Thanks.
Barber.
This was fun.
And thank you all for being here. God bless you in your rest and your worship and your study.